The railway age, as historians tell it, began modestly. Small steam engines, experimental tracks, a technology still finding its footing in the early decades of the 19th century. By the 1840s and 1850s, rail networks were expanding, but they were expanding into a world where most cities had populations that would seem almost rural by modern standards. Manchester, one of the great industrial centers of the era, held around 300,000 people. Philadelphia, a major American hub, sat somewhere near 120,000. These were not small places by the standards of their time. But they were not the metropolises we might imagine when we look at what was built to serve them. Because what was built, in city after city, country after country, across a span of roughly 40 years, was not modest at all. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. The terminal buildings constructed between approximately 1840 and 1890 are, by any honest measurement, among the largest structures ever raised for civilian use in human history. Their vaulted iron roofs stretched wider than medieval cathedrals. Their waiting halls could absorb tens of thousands of standing bodies without feeling crowded. Their facades, cut stone, arched windows 30 meters high, colonnades running the full length of city blocks, were designed and executed with a precision and labor investment that seems, on paper, wildly disproportionate to the passenger volumes of the time. That is the first thing worth sitting with. Not the beauty of these buildings, not the engineering, the proportion, the ratio between what was built and what was needed. St. Pancras Station in London opened in 1868. Its train shed, the iron and glass roof structure spanning the tracks, was, at the time of its completion, the largest single-span roof on Earth. The span measured approximately 73 meters. To put that in context, the entire width of many city blocks today is narrower than that roof. The Midland Railway, which commissioned the structure, was at the time running a volume of trains that used perhaps a third of that space practically. The shed was not built for current demand. It was built at a scale that would only make sense, if it ever fully made sense, decades later. This might be dismissed as Victorian ambition. The British were known for excess in their public works. Except the pattern is not British. Frankfurt Hauptbahnhof, completed in 1888, deployed 3 parallel iron-arched halls side by side, each one individually comparable in scale to St. Pancras. The combined interior volume was staggering. Frankfurt at the time of the station's opening held fewer than 200,000 residents. The station's theoretical capacity at full design load was calculated by engineers of the period to accommodate traffic flows that the city would not realistically generate for another 30 to 50 years. The same anomaly appears in Antwerp, in Milan, in Washington, in Budapest, in cities whose populations and rail traffic in the 1880s bore no proportional relationship to the structures that were raised to receive them. There is a conventional explanation for this, and it is worth stating clearly. Victorian and Edwardian engineers, the argument goes, were projecting forward. They were building not for the present but for the future they anticipated, a future of industrial expansion, urban migration, growing commerce. They built large because they believed large would eventually be justified. This explanation is reasonable. It accounts for ambition. It accounts for civic pride. It accounts for the desire of cities to signal their importance through monumental architecture. But the explanation begins to strain when you examine the specifics more carefully. Washington Union Station, completed in 1907, was designed with a main waiting room modeled explicitly on the baths of Diocletian in Rome. A structure built for a city of over 1 million people at the height of imperial power. The waiting room's coffered ceiling rose 29 meters. The building's total footprint covered nearly 75,000 square meters. Washington, D.C., in 1907 had a population of approximately 280,000 people. Rail passenger volumes at the time of opening, while significant, represented a small fraction of the building's practical capacity. When engineers were asked during the planning phase why the structure needed to be so large, the answers recorded in contemporary documents speak of future growth, national dignity, and the station as a symbol of the Republic. These are architectural and political arguments. They do not resolve the engineering question of why systems built for future demand were constructed with such immediate completeness, not as expandable frameworks but as finished monuments. This is a meaningful distinction. When a building is constructed for anticipated future growth, the typical engineering approach involves staged development. A core structure is completed, with planned expansion wings, infrastructure connections designed for later addition, foundational work that anticipates additions. Look at the railway expansion across the eastern United States in the latter half of the 19th century. The transcontinental ambition is well understood, linking coasts, opening territory, enabling settlement. That narrative has a clear demand logic. Population was moving west. Infrastructure had to anticipate and enable it. But look more carefully at the stations built in towns that were not on the transcontinental corridors. Secondary lines, branch lines, regional connectors linking smaller settlements to larger hubs. Some of these stations, built in the 1870s and 1880s, are structurally substantial in a way that defies the economic rationale of branch line investment. Brick construction, elevated platforms, covered waiting areas, ticket halls with ceiling heights that suggest volume, formality, permanence. The towns they served at the time of construction were small. Some remain small. The stations have outlasted the traffic they were supposedly built to handle. There is an analytical posture worth adopting here, not skepticism of the historical record, but a different kind of attention to what the record actually contains. This is how most large civic projects from the same era handled growth projections. The grand railway terminals were not built this way. They were built complete, finished, as if the full scale of the demand was not being predicted, as if it was being assumed. Leipzig Hauptbahnhof, opened in 1915 after years of construction, holds the distinction of being one of the largest railway stations in the world by floor area, a distinction it still holds today. 26 platforms. A main hall running the full width of the structure with no interior support columns interrupting the span. The infrastructure buried beneath the building, drainage, ventilation, service corridors, was engineered at a complexity that contemporary observers described as exceeding anything currently required by the city's actual rail traffic. Leipzig's population at the time of opening, roughly 600,000. The station was designed for a city at least twice that size, operating a rail network at least 3 times the density then in existence. Infrastructure built ahead of demand is not unusual. Infrastructure built at a scale that seems to assume the demand already exists. That is a different category of observation. What separates these buildings from ordinary overbuilding is not any one feature. It is the consistency of the pattern. City after city, country after country, decade after decade. Terminals designed and completed with a fullness that sits uneasily with the populations and traffic volumes of their moment. The mismatch is not small, and it is not isolated. When you begin to map these structures, not as individual architectural achievements, but as a coordinated typology spread across a specific window of time, a question starts to form that the conventional explanations don't quite close. Not why were these buildings grand, but why were they so specifically, so uniformly, so completely ready? Consider what it actually takes to build a structure like Washington Union Station or Leipzig Hauptbahnhof. Not the money, not the political will, the logistics. The stone used in the facade of Washington Union Station was quarried, cut, and transported across significant distances at a time when the infrastructure for doing so was, by most accounts, still developing. The ironwork spanning Street Pancras required foundry outputs and precision fabrication that pushed the limits of what British industrial capacity could reliably produce in the 1860s. The drainage and ventilation systems buried beneath these terminals, systems invisible to any passenger, systems that would never be photographed or celebrated, were engineered to specifications that implied not just competence, but a level of coordinated planning rarely associated with first-generation construction. These were not buildings that were figured out as they went up. They arrived, in their documentation, already fully resolved. Architectural historians note that the design-to-completion timelines for several of these terminals are unusually compressed given their complexity. Frankfurt Hauptbahnhof's design process, when examined closely, shows relatively little of the iterative revision typical of large Victorian public works. The foundational decisions, the three-hall configuration, the span dimensions, the underground service layout, appear in early planning documents nearly as complete as they appear in the finished structure. The usual record of rejected alternatives, scaled-back proposals, engineering compromises, it is thinner than one might expect for a building of that ambition. This is not an accusation of anything. It is an observation about process. When a building of great complexity arrives with unusually clean documentation and unusually few visible traces of developmental struggle, the natural question is simply, where did the certainty come from? Expand the frame to the United States, and the pattern takes on a different texture, because in America the scale anomaly is compounded by a geography problem. The great American rail terminals of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were not built in cities that had spent centuries accumulating the civic infrastructure, the financial institutions, the construction labor pools that European capitals had developed over generations. Many of these American cities were, in historical terms, extraordinarily young. Chicago, which by 1900 had produced some of the most ambitious station architecture on the continent, had been incorporated as a city fewer than 70 years before. Cincinnati's Union Terminal, with its famous Art Deco half-dome, its vast concourse, its underground baggage systems, was built in a city that in 1930 held fewer than 500,000 people. The terminal's rotunda, at 49 meters in diameter, remains one of the largest half-domes in the Western Hemisphere. Cincinnati. Not Rome. Not Paris. Not a capital city, not a port of imperial administration. A Midwestern American city, less than a century old at the time of construction, raising a structure of genuinely ancient-seeming permanence and scale. The conventional framework handles this with the language of civic ambition and boosterism. American cities competed aggressively through their public monuments, and the railroad companies that funded these terminals had both the resources and the marketing incentive to build impressively. This is true. It is also incomplete as an explanation, because it still does not account for the engineering specificity beneath the spectacle. Cincinnati Union Terminal's underground infrastructure, its baggage tunnels, its below-grade service corridors, its mechanical systems, was built to handle passenger volumes the city would never, in fact, reach. The terminal's peak usage came in the Second World War, when troop movements briefly justified something approaching its design capacity. Before and after that window, the building operated at a fraction of what it was built to accommodate. This is the detail that keeps recurring. Not that the buildings were large. Not that they were beautiful. But that their service infrastructure, the parts no one sees, the parts that cost money and labor with no aesthetic return, was engineered for a demand that, in most cases, never fully materialized. Shift to the United Kingdom, and a related pattern emerges in the provincial network. The stations built to serve mid-sized British cities in the 1840s through 1870s, not the London terminals, but the regional hubs of Birmingham, Bristol, Newcastle, York, were constructed with waiting rooms, platform canopies, and administrative wings whose scale consistently exceeded the immediate operational requirements of their moment. York Station, rebuilt in its current form and opened in 1877, features a curved train shed of exceptional span serving a city that, at the time, held approximately 50,000 people. The shed's engineering was complex enough that it was studied and referenced by architects across Europe. Its scale implied a traffic volume York would not generate for decades. What makes the British provincial examples particularly interesting is the consistency of the typology across builders. These stations were not all designed by the same architects. They were not all funded by the same railway companies. The Great Western Railway, the Midland Railway, the Northeastern Railway, these were competing commercial entities with different aesthetics, different engineering cultures, different financial structures. And yet the proportional relationship between their station infrastructure and their contemporary passenger volumes shows a remarkable uniformity. Different hands, different companies, different cities, same pattern. There is a term that sometimes appears when researchers begin cataloging this particular cluster of anomalies: the infrastructure before demand consistency, the completeness of first-generation construction, the scale that seems calibrated to an assumed rather than a projected population. The term is not an academic designation. It is not used in mainstream architectural history. It circulates in a particular corner of historical re-examination, applied loosely to a set of questions about the 19th century that orthodox frameworks have not, in the view of some researchers, fully answered. The label itself is less important than what it points toward, because the questions it is trying to gather are real questions, even if the answers remain genuinely open. Why does the infrastructure-to-population ratio hold so consistently across unconnected builders and unconnected nations? Why does the underground and service engineering, invisible, economically irrational at the scale it was built, appear so fully realized in first-generation construction? Why do the design records for several of these terminals show so little developmental uncertainty for projects of such unprecedented complexity? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the kind of questions that tend to collect under a single label when enough researchers notice that the conventional explanations, while not wrong exactly, keep leaving the same residue. The residue of something that does not quite add up. And once you have seen the residue in one city, in one terminal, in one set of underground service tunnels built for a population that was not yet there, you start seeing it everywhere. The word Tartaria appears in old maps. This is not a contested fact. European cartographers from the medieval period through the 18th century used the name, variously spelled Tartaria, Tataria, Grand Tartary, to designate large portions of Central Asia, Siberia, and surrounding regions. It appears in the maps of Mercator. It appears in encyclopedias published in the 1700s. It is a documented geographical designation, used by real cartographers, reproduced in real atlases, discussed in real correspondence between real scholars. To that extent, Tartaria is not a mystery. It is a historical label for a territory, applied with varying precision over several centuries, and it fades from standard cartographic use as European geographical knowledge of Asia becomes more granular through the 18th and 19th centuries. That is the straightforward account. The reason the word surfaces in discussions like this one, discussions about railway terminals and infrastructure scale and population ratios, is that a separate and much more contested interpretive tradition has borrowed the name and attached it to a different set of questions entirely. It points, instead, at a category of architectural and infrastructural evidence, the kind of evidence this documentary has been examining, and suggests that the standard historical narrative of who built these structures, when and under what conditions may be incomplete. This is an interpretive position. It is not a conclusion supported by verified documentary evidence in the conventional historical sense. That distinction matters and it should not be blurred. What the interpretive tradition does at its most coherent is ask a specific type of question. If the grand railway terminals of the 19th century were built by the entities the historical record names, private railway companies, municipal governments, competing national engineering cultures, then what explains the consistency of the scale anomaly across all of them? What explains the completeness of first-generation underground infrastructure? What explains the compressed design timelines and the relative absence of documented developmental uncertainty for projects of genuinely unprecedented complexity? The mainstream historical answer is a combination of factors: shared architectural publishing and knowledge transfer across Europe and America, the influence of a relatively small number of highly trained engineers who moved between projects and countries, the competitive civic ambitions of industrializing cities, and the genuine forward projection of demand by builders who understood that rail travel was transforming human mobility in ways that would only accelerate. These factors are real. They are documented. They explain a great deal. Some researchers argue they do not explain everything. The gap between what these factors explain and what the physical evidence presents, that gap is where the Tartaria interpretive label tends to be placed. Not as an answer. As a placeholder for a question that the standard framework has not, in their view, satisfactorily closed. There are multiple ways to assess this situation honestly. One interpretation holds that the gap is illusory, that it dissolves under closer examination of the actual historical record. and that the sense of anomaly is produced by selective attention to certain data points while underweighting the explanatory power of documented industrial and commercial processes. Architectural historians who have studied these terminals in depth often land here. The scale makes sense, they argue, once you fully account for the economics of railway company competition, the labor conditions of the period, and the genuine sophistication of Victorian engineering culture. A second interpretation holds that the gap is real but explicable within orthodox history, that the consistency of the typology reflects a degree of international coordination and knowledge sharing among engineers and architects that has been underappreciated rather than suppressed. Some academic work on the circulation of architectural ideas in the 19th century supports this view. The technical journals of the period show a remarkable density of cross-national reference and influence that could, in principle, account for the uniformity of approach across unconnected builders. A third interpretation, the one that gathers under the Tartaria label, holds that the gap points towards something structural in the historical record itself. Not necessarily a conspiracy of concealment. Not necessarily a lost civilization in any dramatic sense. But perhaps a set of assumptions built into how the 19th century has been narrated and documented. Assumptions that make certain questions difficult to ask within the standard framework without being categorized as fringe. This documentary is not equipped to adjudicate between these interpretations, nor does it attempt to. What it can do is note that the physical evidence, the terminals themselves, remains fully visible. These buildings have not been reinterpreted away. St. Pancras still stands. Leipzig Hauptbahnhof still operates. Cincinnati Union Terminal still houses a museum inside a rotunda built for a population that never came. The stone is still cut. The iron vaults still span their impossible widths. The underground corridors, built for volumes that most of these cities never generated, are still there beneath the platforms. The evidence is not disputed. Only the explanation is. And perhaps that is the most honest place to leave this particular examination, not with a verdict, but with the observation that honest inquiry sometimes produces questions more durable than the answers that have been offered for them. The railway terminals of the 19th century were built by someone, for something, at a scale that the populations of their moment did not require and, in many cases, never fully used. The records that exist explain the who and the how with varying degrees of completeness. The question of the proportional reasoning, of why the certainty of that scale was so uniformly present across so many unconnected builders, remains, in the most careful reading of the available evidence, not entirely closed. Some researchers will continue to examine that gap using conventional historical methodology. Others will continue to reach for alternative interpretive frameworks, Tartaria among them, not because the framework is proven but because the questions it responds to are genuine. The terminals stand either way. Patient, oversized, and waiting, as they have always seemed to be waiting, for something the history books have not yet fully named.